well. And so I just wanted to sort of frame it that way. First of all, it's really coming from the community. I think that the key point, I'm going to go and give, in the 8 minutes that I have, give a little bit of an overview of what the bill actually looks at and what the Real ID Act actually does, which is a federal legislation passed in 2005. But I just also want to frame this by saying that I think the key takeaway for anyone interested in getting involved is not that you do not have to be an expert on the Real ID Act, you do not have to be an expert on this bill. The key thing is that legislators need to hear from you and from your congregations and your colleagues and friends that this is a core voting issue. Because right now, even though polling shows that a majority of likely voters in New Jersey support making driver's licenses available for people regardless of immigration status, it's still viewed as a controversial issue by the Democratic leadership. And so what we're seeing is that even though there's majority of support, the bill is not being moved, it's not going forward. And I think it's really important for every legislator to hear from their constituents and for leadership to hear Speaker Coughlin and Sweeney in particular, to hear from their constituents that this is a core voting issue. And it's not only a liability for them to support it, in fact, it would be a liability for them not to support it. So having said that, the two bills that we're talking about here in New Jersey are bill number 4743 in the Assembly and 3229 in the Senate. And all of this information is on the Let's Drive NJ campaign website, so you don't have to memorize that. These bills are two of them are exactly the same. They make a series of changes that would help the state to implement the Real ID Act and enhance public safety. Among other things, they would remove the requirement of proving certain immigration status for a standard license. So we're going into a system now with the implementation of Real ID where we're going to have a standard license and a Real ID type license. The standard license, if this bill passed, would be available regardless of immigration status. If this bill doesn't pass, if there's no legislation, then we would stick with our current law, which requires people to show lawful immigration status to get a license or a permit or a state ID card. The bill would also allow the Motor Vehicles Commission to charge more for a Real ID license and less for a standard license because it's more expensive to create Real ID licenses. And this cost structure is also important in terms of a very big goal, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, for privacy reasons, making sure that the group of people applying for the standard license is very broad. We don't want this to be a list of just people who don't have lawful immigration status. We want this to be an ID that's useful for everybody. This also, and as Joanna mentioned, it also ensures that Motor Vehicles Commission would be allowed to give an expanded list of documents they could accept for for proving identity, whereas for a Real ID license, they have to stick to the documents approved by the federal government. For a standard license, they wouldn't have to. And that is something that can benefit people, a range of people who don't have easy access to documents, people who are very low income, who've moved a lot, people who are domestic violence survivors and have had to flee without taking their documents, people who've been homeless, people returning from incarceration, among others, youth and teenagers as well. So what is a Real ID? Real ID is a piece of federal legislation passed in 2005, 13 years ago, but it's just getting implemented now because it was very controversial and a lot of states objected to having to be part of the system. It's framed as a way to increase the security of state driver's license systems, but the concern is that it's also creating nationwide, in effect, a nationwide database that the federal government can access, whether for immigration enforcement or FBI investigations, to where it's very easy for the federal government to access state data. Every state, starting in October 2020, will have to be offering a Real ID compliant license, and once that rule goes into effect, which New Jersey has gotten many extensions, but once that rule goes into effect, it will mean that somebody would need a Real ID compliant license to board a plane in New Jersey or using a New Jersey ID. But it's not actually requiring everyone to have one. So for example, if I have a passport and I can use that to board a plane, I may not need a Real ID compliant license. And so the state can and will be offering a standard license that is not used for federal purposes. The only thing a Real ID compliant license would be required for under federal law is boarding a plane, accessing a nuclear facility, or accessing other federal facilities. So for federal benefits, for state purposes, for voting or voter registration, there is no need to have a Real ID license. The license, what does New Jersey have to change to be compliant with Real ID? Well, right now, following litigation by the ACLU of New Jersey, the state government does not retain copies of documents that people submit to prove their identity. This is a big deal because if they retain the documents, they're keeping them in a database, and that makes people vulnerable to identity theft. It makes, and cybercrime, it also means that there's a database that the federal government can access. And that can be really important. For example, if someone's in removal proceedings and they've used a Mexican driver's license, which they can't currently use, but if they've used an ID that shares some information about their immigration status or where they were born, for example, that could be something used against them in an immigration case. And there are a lot of people who care about privacy who have been opposed to the idea of Real ID for many years and have been fighting it. Now that it looks like New Jersey is going ahead with the implementation, I think it's even more important to ensure that we make this standard license, this alternative license, something that people can really use, and that we get people know about it, that there's buy-in, because we really need this to be a database that includes everyone, or includes a large group of people. The cards, Real ID cards, also have to be machine readable and have to have certain security features, which create the additional expenses. Part of why the Motor Vehicles Commission would like to be able to charge more for them, which they can't do under current law. As I said, New Jersey is taking this approach of having a two-tiered system, but we still don't have the legislation that would allow the Motor Vehicles Commission, which is supportive of this idea, that there's no legislation that would allow them to make this license available to people who don't have federal immigration status. We also need legislation to make sure that there could be a third gender option. So right now there's only male or female markers for non-binary New Jerseyans. It's not only an identity issue, but a safety and security issue to be able to have an ID that accurately reflects their gender identity. So that's something that we want to see in the new legislation. It is also, as I said, something that's critical for low-income communities, for survivors of domestic violence, for a wide range of constituencies. And I think that just to come back to my earlier point, I want to talk a little bit about what's going on in the legislature. From what we are hearing, the leadership in the Democratic leadership, which should support this idea, is putting the brakes on, is telling members not to speak out about the legislation or not to sign on if they're in swing districts. I think this is where everyone on this webinar comes in. It's critically important for legislators to hear from their constituents that this is not only an issue that you would generally support, but that it's a motivating issue. It's a core voting issue. And so I think the details, as I said, the details of the bill are not key. We are working a lot at the ACLU, working a lot on enhancing the privacy protections of this bill. And I'm glad, since I'm running out of time, I'm glad to answer any questions about that later. We take the privacy part of it really seriously. You've probably read some reporting just yesterday and today about how the federal government is using facial recognition software and requesting access to DMV databases to do that. This is a really serious concern. There are a lot of different ways that the federal government tries to access databases, many of them in secret. So we're working very hard to both find out what's currently being shared and to make sure that there are strong provisions in the legislation to protect this data. But it's not an either or question. There's going to be The federal government is going to be implementing Real ID. They're going to be accessing New Jerseyans' data. So we need to figure out the best way to protect the data, the most limited way to collect data and still carry out the functions of the license. And at the same time, we need to make sure that people can drive to work and that people are not targeted and victimized by law enforcement and especially federal immigration enforcement simply because they are not legally entitled to get a license. So the ACLU basically views this as a basic civil rights issue. And so happy to talk more about that or about privacy if people have questions.
Thank you so much, Farron. Really informative. Russ, I know you have time limits, so let me jump right in and let Russ tell us about Success in New York.
Thank you so much. And it's really wonderful to be here with my neighbors across the river. Really, really appreciate it. And I want to talk a little bit, Farron, the way Farron sort of wound up actually really dovetails well with the story I want to tell, which is one of how Reformed Jewish communities in New York, as part of the network known as RAC New York, were able to really help bring home driver's licenses in New York City. One of the key things that we noticed in our process around choosing which issue we as a network were going to tackle first was we saw that there was opportunity for us to have multiple places where we could make a real impact. We saw that a lot of our communities had members in the Assembly or the Senate in New York on the Transportation Committee. We realized that we would be one of the, if not the first, mainstream religious network to endorse this, and that we had significant populations in communities and in districts where people were not necessarily expecting to hear from us, right? Some of those swing districts in the Senate particularly, but also for, suburban and rural Democrats who weren't expecting, a bunch of Reformed Jews to walk in and say, hey, we really care about this. This is a Jewish issue for us. This is something that we see as critical. Again, what Rabbi Katz said beautifully about how many times it says we're supposed to look after the stranger. Like, this is something that's critical to us, to our story and our history. And we really made an impression with that. We had one Jewish legislator who used to be a member of a Reformed community, and members of a Reformed community in her district came as part of our lobby day to sit down with her. And as they were speaking with her, they said this is a Jewish issue, and she laughed at them. And so they explained to her, right, this is about our religious tradition. This is about the journeys of our families, right, of us. This is about members of our community, whether they are staff people in our community or our relatives or our neighbors or our friends. That this is something that's really important. And by speaking with a Jewish voice, something I know Reformed Jewish Voice in New Jersey is familiar with, but by speaking with a Jewish voice, we're able to really bring a different and moral argument to this from a place that they're not expecting. And I think if you haven't already had in-district meetings on this or had call-in days on this yet, I would encourage you to make sure to note that you're calling from a Reformed Jewish community, that you're calling from a network of Reformed Jewish communities that make this a priority, because that was something that was really key to our work, key to our being able to make impact. We had a multifaceted campaign that utilized all of the sort of different pieces of the puzzle that we could think of, right? So we engaged in somewhat more traditional tactics, right? We had call-in days. Those call-in days were on Purim and over Passover as a way for us to really sort of amplify how we saw this as a Jewish issue. We also did some in-person work with our teens. Our Nifty Teens had their own lobby day. We also had a RAC New York's inaugural Albany gathering in Albany, where we had nearly 90 people from over 20 congregations come together to meet, to learn more about the issue, and to then go lobby their members in person. We also had some communities where they were also lobbying their folks in district, either because they couldn't come or because they wanted multiple bites at the apple. But we wanted to let folks know one of our tactics of doing this multiple times and having several call-in days was about showing our determination. And this is something that some of our folks are maybe not necessarily used to, right? They're used to, maybe we already called in. That's something I heard a little bit about, right? We already did a call-in day. And so the frame that I gave back to folks was, for the people who oppose this, do you really think they're going to call once, right? We need to build our determination and show that we are not a group of people that are going to give up easily or be swayed by it. Oh yeah, I really support it. I'm just waiting for, this to happen, or I promise I'm going to be a co-sponsor. I just need to make sure the paperwork gets in. The paperwork is really slow. These are all things that we heard throughout the course of our campaign, and we need to be persistent to show that we are a force to be reckoned with. We also utilized, as I think some of you did, the consultation on conscience, which is every other year reform movement event, where we had 100 leaders together, some of whom had been doing work on driver's licenses for all with us. Others were just being introduced to us because RAC New York as an entity is actually relatively new. We've been in existence mostly the last year and change. And we were asking folks, and this is one of the places where we started to sort of expand the kind of tactics we were using. We were asking folks to not just think about themselves, but also to think about who in their families lived in key districts, who of their friends lived in key districts, right, to try to mobilize their networks. We also worked with congregational teams to say, okay, you've been starting to do outreach on this, but who is not in your conversations that you want to be there? Use this time as an opportunity to strategize about how you can have a team that really represents a wider portion of the congregation that can help you move the congregation on this. And we started to use some a little bit more, other pieces. We started to ask folks to think about this a little bit like a corporate campaign. So to think about who in your congregation, is there somebody in your congregation that's connected to a big industry that might be able to give another level of credence to this campaign? So one of the tactics that worked in New York State was we were able to build with our coalition, we were able to build something that really was multifaceted. Immigrant justice groups were at the forefront. We had, we were involved. There were other Jewish groups that were involved. We had the Council of Churches involved. We had the Business Council of New York involved. The insurance industry associations in New York State were also involved. But to start thinking about who are other not traditional voices that can turn up the pressure on legislators waiting to make decisions. And the other thing, frankly, that Reformed Jewish congregations have that maybe are not as accessible to other partners in this fight is we have machers, right? For folks who are not familiar with Yiddish, that's like, important key leaders in your communities, right? So you maybe have a legislator in your community. You maybe have a leader of a nonprofit in your community. You maybe have somebody that donates a lot to the speaker's reelection campaign or the Assembly Democrats campaign on, right? You have people that are in these places that if you're in relationship with them and you can have a thoughtful conversation with them, and this is something that moves them, that can help you turn up the pressure. And the last thing I'll say is this was especially useful for us in terms of leadership, is really demonstrating that we were not specific to one area, but that we are a statewide network was key. One of the ways we did this was we worked with the coalition to build out a clergy letter on Long Island, because Long Island was our swing area, really more so than, much more so than the rest of the state. So we worked with clergy leaders of different faiths to build out a letter. I'm excited to say about half of the folks that signed it were Reformed Jewish leaders, which was really gratifying. Chances for me to work with those leaders. And we had another clergy leader of RAC New York was based in Albany. So he hand delivered these letters to the legislative offices of those 6 in Albany while they were in session, and to the leader's office. And one of the Senate leaders who is actually giving us a little bit of a challenge was like, another rabbi that the senator knows just called us today. And our rabbi that went in there, the other rabbi that went in there, Don Cashman, said, "Oh yeah, well I went to HUC with him." So we were able to really put some pressure to the point where the Senate leader, when somebody mentioned that they were from RAC New York, said, "Oh, you guys have been calling me a lot." And so being able to utilize our numbers, our relationships, to be persistent in what we're doing, and to be thoughtful and think a little creatively, the bedrock tactics are really important to do, but we have the ability also to be a little bit more creative with how we're able to push things forward. And we were really able to, we were able to really connect with legislators and push them to take a position that they wouldn't have necessarily taken otherwise, as a way to really help bring this home.
Oops. There we go. Thank you so much. So you see, we have a lot of new and creative ideas of ways that we can support this campaign beyond what we've been doing. So far, we have met with legislators in Trenton. We have called them. We have shown up, although maybe not in the numbers we could, at rallies and events that are held by the campaign. But I hope that as we go forward, that you understand that having spoken with our legislators once is not enough. So this summer is a great time for us to reconnect with our legislators, to get a team from our congregations or communities to go together and really impress the urgency of this issue. We can be planning a call-in day, and I love the idea of doing this around holiday. So perhaps around the holy days is a good time, but there are always other dates that we can wrap a call-in day around if the campaign supports us doing this sooner. And also if you feel like there are congregants in your congregation who need to know more about this, who need to get the information that we've heard today. I have managed to record this on my phone, and hopefully we'll be able to somehow get it up on our website. But we also encourage gatherings for learning and planning and action within your congregations, and we can help you do that. I would love it if people on this call could use your chat to note what you commit to do as a next step as we move forward. And of course, always in partnership with Let's Drive and with the New Jersey Alliance of Immigrant Justice to make sure that we're doing this in a coordinated way. So for those who need to go, we promised a half hour of information. Thank you so much for joining, but we're going to stay on and have some time for discussion and questions. So wonder who would like to ask while we have our wonderful leaders and activists on the phone here. So a question I have for you, Joanna, as you hear some of these strategies and looking to engage insurance industry and maybe corrections officers too, are these areas that the campaign has reached out to?
Yes, so we are looking for law enforcement to support. If any of you have contacts in your local police departments, please let us know. We have been reaching out to local departments in cities where they have already come out to support. Hopefully law enforcement can come out. Law enforcement is tough, but it's also one of those voices that really make a difference in this conversation to really explain what the public safety angle is. We have been in touch with the Insurance Council as well. They have committed to testifying in support. We're actually asking to see if they could do more, and I know they're in touch with other partners and their colleagues in other states. I think what happened in New York has been helpful too, because we're able to see what voices have come out of New York and other states that might have contemporaries in New Jersey. That includes, for instance, in the agricultural networks. If any of the Farm Bureau, some farmers, we have key farmers that really should be coming out to speak and support. So if folks have contacts within the Farm Bureau, with some of the leadership on the Farm Bureau, that's a good place to start. Some of these other industries have obviously benefit. New Jersey, I don't think we think of Jersey as this, but we are a huge agricultural state. We have a lot of those networks there. The dairy farmers, all the fishing networks as well in South Jersey are really helpful. So those are the different groups that we have been trying to reach out to. I think more voices would be helpful. I know that we had an op-ed from then Chief Cryan, who was the sheriff in Union County maybe 4 years ago. He is now a senator. But if you all have those contacts in law enforcement, that'll be really helpful.
Great, thank you. We have a question out. If someone could speak to the financial benefits to the state. I know you had mentioned that, Joanna, with the truck, but can we maybe have some points that we can be sharing?
Yeah, I can definitely speak to that. So New Jersey Policy Perspective actually is one of our member organizations, partners, who's been really supportive of the Let's Drive NJ campaign. They have some really good information that they just put out an explainer on why New Jersey should expand access to driver's licenses. That came out in February of this year. And so what they actually talk about is the benefits of the impact. I'm going to start with numbers first in terms of the number of residents that would benefit, because that actually informs the numbers that we're looking at. Undocumented people, just to be more specific about what I said before, is 425,920. People who earn less than $25,000 a year also would benefit from this legislation. So you're talking about 288,000 people in that number. Formerly incarcerated and reentry communities, we're looking at about 5,000 people. That's where the 719,000 people come from. So once you look at all those folks, you look at the licensing fees that would be that the state would benefit from, because the state, folks are going to have to pay for their licensing fees, their registration fees, insurance fees. You're looking at a huge number. I think the last number I had seen, we were looking at $50 million just in licensing fees, $90 million just on insurance premiums. The Insurance Council likes to say that we can't guarantee that premiums will drop. So I'm not going to say that will drop. New Jersey is actually some of the most expensive insurance in the nation, because we have very fancy cars and people like to insure them at a very high level. However, we would potentially see more people who are insured, which also should benefit the pool of insurers, which also ends up being a financial benefit for the state of New Jersey. That's actually why we said $90 million a year in New Jersey. That's what the truck was about, is we were basically saying that if you add up all that money, we're leaving $90 million at the table every single year that New Jersey doesn't passes, because that includes your licensing fees and your registration fees. That's not the other stuff that I mentioned as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Other questions?
Hi, this is Trish Perlmutter. I'm a member of Near to Mead and have been working at Near to Mead to try to support the legislation and get phone calls made. I really appreciated Russ's ideas about more things that we could be doing. I'm also policy counsel at Partners for Women in Justice, and we provide free legal representation to victims of domestic violence. And I just wanted to echo the comments that Joanna and Karen made about how valuable this legislation is for victims of domestic violence. Domestic violence is a leading cause of homelessness, and we also are very much aware that for undocumented victims of domestic violence, they are often reluctant to call the police or access the courts. So a driver's license can be very powerful in helping those victims access social services, legal services, make them feel more comfortable and confident if they do need to call the police. And we feel that this legislation is extremely important to support victims' steps towards reasserting their independence and safety. I'd also just like to say that I'm working with my daughter right now, who just turned 17 last week, and she's trying to get her driver's license, and I often think it's scary getting in the car with her, and why should she be able to get a license in this state when we have so many New Jersey residents who, frankly, are a lot more qualified, have much better judgment, who should be able to drive, and that would make our state safer for everyone.
Thank you, Trish. Really appreciate that this this bill impacts so many in our state. I hear too from people who are seniors who can't find their documents because they've moved so many times or don't remember where they've put things, but have the wherewithal to drive and will have trouble with this Real ID.
Hey folks, this is Russ. I unfortunately have to jump off, but if there's anything I can do to be supportive of this, I'm happy to be in touch. I'm excited to see New Jersey join us on the right side of history. Thanks so much for all you're doing. Keep fighting, and best of luck, and forward. More soon.
Thanks so much, Russ. Really appreciate it. Okay. I want to let folks on the call know, too, that you can see the power of having a dedicated organizer working on an issue in the way that our partners have and that we've not been able to. But we are working toward that in New Jersey, and we hope by end of year to have an organizer for Reformed Jewish Voice of New Jersey, and we'll be able to deepen our efforts. We're not waiting for the organizer, but we'll be able to strengthen our voice with that help. Any other questions or comments? So again, this was an experiment to talk first to hear first and talk later. I so appreciate Joanna and Farron, your wealth of knowledge and engagement in this issue, and inspiration for us all to join in, and we will continue to work together. And again, I urge everyone on the call to think, what is the next step I will take? And we will move forward together. Thank you
all so much for your support. You guys have been wonderful as well. It's always great to have so many voices, really talking to legislators and the leaders of the state to really make them understand that this is a priority for all of us.
Thank you. And Farron, any final words from you?
No, I completely agree. That's exactly what needs to happen for this to move forward. And I'm thrilled to hear that you're hiring an organizer and really digging in after all the support you've already shown through the campaign. So yes, we look forward to working with you all.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. And in parting, just wishing us strength to strength, and we'll be talking again soon. Thanks all.
Everyone.